Hello guys, what's up? So this is me, Kurt Zeus, and for today's video lecture, we'll be discussing all about an introduction to globalization. So globalization, by the way, guys, is the main concept or theme that we'll be analyzing and studying in the subject called the contemporary world. So, so being the first lesson, we have to define what is globalization because this would now be the foundation of this subject. And later we'll be looking into such topics such as economic globalization, political globalization, globalization and mass media, globalization and religion and so forth. No? Okay, so what comes in your mind when you hear the word globalization? Or what can you visualize when you read the word globalization? Now, some of you would now think that globalization is basically we see the globe, then there are connecting lines among countries or states. Now, basically, tama naman yun, no? So, when we define globalization, there are a lot of definitions of globalization, by the way. But may I just pick the most simple, the simplest, actually. So, globalization is basically how nation states connect with one another. So, basically, how does Philippines connects itself towards the world, towards United States, towards China, or other entities such as ASEAN, United Nations, or even companies such as McDonald's, Samsung, etc. Now, to further understand, let us look into the root words or etymology. So we have global and we have ization. Now, why does the term global, yun yung pinili natin sa globalization? Bakit hindi Earth? Bakit hindi world? Or bakit nga ba pinili natin would now be globalization? Now, let's look into the definition. So, o nga no, bakit hindi Earthization? Although hindi naman corny, pero there's a probability na pwede namang Earth yung gamitin natin as a prefix or the main root word or worldization. Bakit pinili globalization? Now, let us look into these definitions because these definitions as well will now be the part or concepts that we'll be studying sooner or later. Now, when we look into the term Earth, Earth simply is the name of the planet. So, looking into your astronomy, di ba? Or in your science subjects. So, the name of the planet before us would now be Venus. Then after us would now be Mars. The largest planet would now be Jupiter. So, may mga pangalan yung ating mga planeta. So, Earth is basically as well derived from yung lupa, the soil. Kaya nga in English, for instance, we term the soil as the earth. You dig the earth, di ba? Earth. Although this is a main English trivia, the earth is derived from the term dirt, lupa, di ba? Dirt. Yun, dirt, no? Dirt, which basically means lupa. So, yun yung pangalan ng ating planeta. However, bakit hindi Earthization? There's something with globe later. Now, going with world is quite a general terminology. So, when we look into the term world, general terminology siya, it technically refers to the social, cultural, and geographical domain. Kaya for instance, no, when we refer the Middle East portion or the Middle East region of the world, wherein we have Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Egypt for instance, ang label natin dun sa Middle East is the Islamic world. Now look dito class social, cultural. Middle East is the geographical domain, Middle Eastern region, that part, geography. Now, the composition of the people there, quote-unquote, social and cultural, would now be yung world definition. Ano nga ba meron sa Islamic world? People could now speak Arabic. Cultural yan. Social. Their religion is Islam. When it comes to customs and tradition, culture, probably similarities. They like dates, they like chicken curry, etc. Not to generalize, no, but in order for us to understand world, kaya nga yung term na dun is Islamic world. It's a combination of social and geographical. Or another instance, when we hear the word Oriental world, we're referring it to the Chinese, to the Japanese, and the Koreans. So nakikita natin yung geographical domain is Asia. When we look into the culture, the social, we're looking into the, for instance, religion natin would now be Buddhism. How do people eat? So in terms of tradition, they eat through chopsticks. Rice is a common staple food. Or for instance, clothing. Silk is abundant. So clothing, culture, di ba? So doon natin nakikita ang world. Now, world is basically a thing to be analyzed sa globalization. But what makes globalization, or why does the term globe is being used in the term globalization? Now, when we define globe, Globe is quite specific. This is now the most, or rather the best word that will now fit in dun sa notion natin all about globalization. Specific in the sense, it refers to the geometrical, astronomical, and planetary concept or aspect. But wait, there's a question. We're looking into contemporary world as social sciences, but looking into globe in its definition, baka science naman to, or rather physical sciences. Now look into uh, the specific features of the globe or the term globe, no? Why globe in globalization? Now, yung globe na ginagamit natin sa sciences, 'di ba? Or sa science subject natin, it's a visual or ginagamit natin as a visual aid. 'Di ba may yung globe? So, spherical yung shape, tapos pwede nating iikot. When we look deeper or when we look in detail dun sa globe na yan, 'di ba yung globe is like the map, where the map has divisions. So yung divisions na yun are called boundaries. Now this would now dictate that these divisions are called countries or rather nation states. Now when we look into globalization, how nation states connect with one another, makikita natin yan sa globe. So for instance, those boundaries will now create, for instance, the People's Republic of China. Then yung mga neighboring countries niya such as Japan. And through that, we could now see those boundaries, those political divisions. So divided yung globe. And divided siya, and we will now look into the connection of those divisions or what we call as nation states. So we have to analyze nation states. Now going back muna, nation states. So some of you would now be confused or rather these two terms are similar. Lagi natin siya nagagamit. Philippine nation, Philippine state. So medyo similar siya, no? But we have to distinguish the difference between these two in order for us to understand globalization. And another thing, we will be encountering nation states repeatedly in the course of the subject. So ano nga ba itong nation states? Now ganito lang yung difference, no. So when we talk about nation, it refers to the cultural entity of that country. Now speaking about country is basically the general aspect. Now nation and state specific siya. So nation refers to the cultural entity, quote unquote race, ethnicity, you could include religion, what else? Language, dialects. So yan yung nation. While on the other hand, when we talk about the state refers to the political entity. So talking about political entity, remember your political science, ano yung four compositions ng ating state or elements? We have people, territory, government, and sovereignty. Or simply, we could now distinguish for easy memorization, state is equated to the government. So political entity siya. Now, there are some instances that the nation and state could be used in a similar way or in the same way. However, we must also understand that sometimes we must separate, we must use both terminologies in a separate notion. Now, ano ibig sabihin ko nito, no? And another thing, how to distinguish yung difference niya lalo, no? So let us look into the difference or how to use these terminologies. So for instance, we see this map. Now there's a quote stating that there's a possibility that there is one nation but there are several states. Now this is for instance yung sinasabi ko kanina na Middle East or yung Islamic world with the L. So nakikita natin dito is that we have one nation. Ano yung nationality nila? Arabo or Arabs. So looking into the cultural aspect, we have one religion, Islam, Sunni Islam. Kaya hindi nasali dito yung Iran. Iran is Persian actually, not Arab. So we have Sunni Islam. In terms of language, we have Arabic. In terms of customs, very similar yung customs. They like eating dates. They like chicken curry. Although not to generalize, just to give you a point of view or a perspective, diba? So in terms of nationality, isa lang nationality nila. But they are divided into states. Saudi Arabia, for instance, an absolute monarchy. Egypt, a republic. What else? Libya, which is now currently transiting to a republic. Or Somalia, diba? They are divided into several states. So basically, one nation, but many states. Or another distinguished, no, or difference. Talk about America. United States is a single state. And but probably some of you would be confused. United States, madaming estado yan. We're looking into the local government unit of the United States called federal states. So ibang federal state, iba yung state. So United States, iisang state. One state, however, the composition would now be composed of many nationalities. Kaya we have white Americans, or rather the appropriate term supposed to be, should be Caucasian Americans, or simply white Americans na lang, no? It's up to you, no, actually. Or another nationality, African Americans, Asian Americans. So yun yung composition ng Amerika. So nagkakaroon ng isang estado, they are united when it comes to politics, if that is the appropriate term, kasi medyo magulo yung politika ng United States. But in terms of nationality, yan, siya, heterogeneous. So iba-iba yan. Or a more appropriate example would now be the Russian Federation. This is what I like with Russia. Russia is a single state. So isa lang, the Federation of Russia. But when you look into the laws, when it comes to citizenship and nationality, Russia accepts dual citizenship. I'll be discussing that one in a separate lesson. Or rather, Russia recognizes that their country is composed of multiple nationalities. So kung nasa Russia ka, the government will not just recognize Russians, but they also recognize, for instance, would now be Chechnyans, Kalmyks, your Tartars. So yun yung composition, Ukrainians. So they recognize different nationalities. And supposedly, dapat ganun nga din sa Pilipinas, no? Just to provide you an insight kasi, no? A lot of us would now claim that the Philippines is basically a united nation and a united state. So isa lang yung nationality natin, Filipino. Are you really sure? Isa lang yung estado natin, which is now the Philippine government. Are you really sure? But let us look into a critical point of view that the Philippines is actually composed of several cultures. If you remember one of this quote, or have you heard of this quote? This was stated by Carlos Romulo, one of the most prominent Filipino statesman and nationalist. He stated that Igorots are not Filipinos. Magiging reactive na tayo dyan actually. However, let us look into the composition, bakit nga ba nasabi yan, which was analyzed as well by William Henry Scott, one of the greatest anthropologists, and was being known to be a recognized son of Cordillera because he contributed a lot in Cordilleran studies. Now going dito, no, when it comes to the culture, sinakop tayo ng mga Espanyol. But basically, did they conquer all regions, all areas in the Philippines? Basically, hindi. Now, hindi nila nasakop tendency na preserve ng ibang tao yung original na kultura. So, looking into the classification of the Philippine culture, we could now classify it into three. The first would now be the Cordillerans, or the Igorot culture, or the Igorot people. The second would now be in terms of the Christianized Filipinos, kung saan nasakop ng mga Espanyol. And the third would now be in terms of the Moro people, or yung mga Muslim brothers natin. Now, looking into these three main classifications, and actually there are subcultures within these main classifications, talaga nga ba na united yung kultura natin, yung nationality natin? Yun yung tignan natin, guys. And basically, this would now be one of the main reasons why the Moro people are fighting for their independence, if that is the appropriate term, or rather groups in Mindanao fighting for their independence, or rather political independence. Just like your Moro people, they claim that they are not Filipinos in the sense, may I rephrase the word, some are claiming not to be Filipinos because they were never been Hispanized or never been Christianized. The term Hispanized means they were influenced by the Spaniards. And when we look into culture, ang nakapag-preserve talaga ng kultura ng Pilipino would now be the Cordillerans and the Moro people. So that is a question when it comes to culture and nationality. And later now comes in yung political entity din natin. When we look into our constitution, for instance, di ba, we have the autonomous region, provisions in our constitution that it allows to regions to able to determine their own rules and customs. That would now be the Cordillera region, although we are not yet autonomous, no, ongoing pa rin yung proposal nila. And we have now your Moro people, which already passed through two political entities, yung ARMM natin, and currently we have your Bangsamoro. So yun, no. So I hope medyo na-distinguish natin yung difference between your nation and a state. Now, bakit ko nga ba na-discuss to, guys, no? And we are talking about globalization. Now, this is my own bias or my own sentiment. The problem kasi with your senior high composition is that not everyone is or rather not everyone are exposed with these concepts when it comes to nationality or rather nation and state. When we look, no, ang na-expose lang naman sa terminologies na to would now be your Hume students, and only a few individuals or students will now pick the Hume strand. Karamihan sa atin would now be STEM, GAS, ABM, or even Tech Voc. So this is basically a review. And another thing, probably my own bias or my own critic kasi, in college, they offer contemporary world. So we immediately jump into a macro perspective without looking into a micro perspective. Paano natin malalaman yung internationalization, ng globalization, the whole globe kung hindi pa natin alam yung sistema dito sa Pilipinas? So basically, I have to provide some reviews or some examples dito sa Philippines, dito sa local domain natin, before we jump into a larger point of view. But regardless to say, ito yung topic natin, no? So let us now define globalization. So it's the how nation states connect with one another. Or in a more operational definition, globalization is the increased interconnectedness with one another. During the time, the ancient periods wherein swords still exist, wala pa yung mga guns natin, may connection na talaga. However, as time goes by, into the time of modernity, mas nagiging interconnected tayo. So we are now becoming independent, if that is one appropriate term or example, with other countries. So yun yung konteksto ng globalization. An increased interconnectedness to other nations or around the international sphere. Now, there are two trends of globalization. This refers now to how nation states connect with one another. So we have internationalization, and we have transnationalization. Now, to further understand these terminologies, we have to look it into the prefix and through some diagrams. So, prefix tayo, no? So, we have inter and trans. Unahin natin yung internationalization. From the prefix inter basically means mutual, reciprocal, reciprocity, and between. Pag sinasabi natin reciprocity, give and take. So, pag sinapak ka, sapakin mo din. Pag hinalikan ka, sapakin mo din, di ba? So, give and take. So, ganun yung natin, yung notion, no? Mutual. So, there should be a mutual. So, both parties would now gain benefit with one another or in between. So, looking into nation states and internationalization, we have two countries, two nation states, China and Philippines, and they are connecting with one another. So, for instance, when it comes to politics, military, China is aiding the military of the Philippines, and Philippines would now give money to China. Or for instance, would now be in terms of economy. By the way, guys, these are just examples. China has abundancy when it comes to formalin. So maraming formalin ng China, Philippines, abundant siya ng banana. So kulang tayo sa formalin, China, kulang sa saging. So magkaka-exchange tayo ng goods and services. Ang tawag pala dun, guys, ay flow. Yung arrows na to, ang term natin dyan would now be in terms of flow. However, when we look into internationalization, we could now see that we have this limit. So nagko-connect tayo pero may limitation yan. Ang tawag natin dyan, guys, would now be barriers. Barriers or rather borders or rather boundaries. Similar terms, 3 B's to be exact. Borders, boundaries, and barriers. So, nagko-connect tayo, however, there are certain barriers. Ano nga ba tong barriers? So, for instance, in political science, may tinatawag tayong sovereignty. So, when we talk about sovereignty, the more appropriate term, closest term rather, would now be independence. So, China is independent, Philippines is independent. So, China will now connect to the Philippines, pero walang karapatan yung China makialam sa politika ng Pilipinas kasi independent yung Philippines. And that is an example of barrier. Or another instance would now be in terms of culture. So because of that border, that barrier, China is able to maintain the inner norms of his nation state. So kahit nakikikonekta ang Pilipinas sa China, China still remains that identity. So yan, no. So kahit tayo dito, kahit nakiki-connect tayo sa China, trade, politics for instance, nare-retain pa rin yung identity ng China. Same as with the Philippines when we talk about internationalization. Now, to further understand internationalization, we as well define transnationalization. Now, looking into the diagram, and into the prefix, by the way. The prefix trans simply means across, beyond, borderless. So nawala na yung barriers. At yung flow, goods and services, politics for instance, nakakaikot na ng malaya dito. Now, take note, there are still boundaries, borders. However, in globalization, there's a term called deterritoriality. When we when we talk about deterritoriality, we sort of remain some of our borders pero unti-unti na nakakapasok yung identity or some aspect, norms rather, ng China. To give you an example, for instance, Filipino-Chinese would now be a product of transnationalization, an infusion, or rather a hybridity, merging of two cultures. So yun na nakikita natin sa transnationalization. Or for instance, politics, where China already intervenes with the politics of the Philippines. So nangyayari dyan, it is already not basically abusing, but it is already changing yung notion natin all about sovereignty, quote-unquote independence. Are we truly free? Yan dyan napapasok yung transnationalization. So medyo I hope na-gets nyo yung difference between internationalization and transnationalization. So more likely, the two concepts will now refer on how nation-states connect with one another. So going forward, or looking forward, or basta forward, we're now looking into the perspective or theories in globalization. Now, these perspective theories, kasi later you'll be encountering a lot of theories, would now pertain to the origins of globalization. Origins and nature of globalization. Or simply just stick with origins. So we have 5: centrism, eurocentrism, presentism, multiculturalism, and orientalism. Now, to define the first perspective is now centrism. Now, centrism is proposed by Immanuel Wallerstein. Now, Immanuel Wallerstein is a proponent of international relations. To those who are studying economics, sociology, and political science. So, sikat na sikat siya, no, when it comes to international relations or the discipline of IR. So, ito yung sinasabi ni Immanuel Wallerstein, no. So, he provided that globalization could now be classified into 3 concepts, no, or 3 levels, wherein we have core, semi-periphery, and periphery. Now, from the term centrism, we now have the central concept, which is now called the core. Now, the central core dominates the world. It would now indicate the system of the world, quote-unquote, talking about economics, political science, sociology, culture. It is the trendsetter of the world. Now, to further understand centrism, let us look into an economic point of view muna. Kasi ito yung sinasabi ni Immanuel Wallerstein. Now, this is the dominant system of the world. Now, to give an example, or rather, to give an example of a system would now be the United States. So, United States currently is recognized to be the core of the globe. Or is it? Probably pwede ng China. Pero gamitin muna natin yung United States. Yan, yung core. Now, the core will now dictate the economic system. So, in economic/Marxist point of view, para siyang yung mga bourgeoisie. So, ang gagawin ng core, ito yung magiging sistema ko. So, ang mangyari dyan is that he will now abuse yung nasa baba sa kanya. So, we have the semi-periphery or the periphery. Now, to give you another example upang maintindihan natin, di ba sinabi ni Marx that there are 2 main classes? So, punta tayo kay Karl Marx, that there are 2 main classes, wherein we have the bourgeoisie, the upper class, and the proletariat, or the lower class, yung mga workers natin. Then, bourgeoisie, yung mga kapitalista natin. Di ba, ang nature ng dalawang classes na yun, the bourgeoisie exploit, abuse the proletariats, the lower classes. At yung gagawin nila is that, how do they exploit them? By taking advantage of the labor. So, yun ang nangyari dyan, no? So, sino nagtatrabaho yung proletariat, pero sinong kumikita? Ang ating mga bourgeoisie. Now, let us now put an analogy between yung class ni Karl Marx, yung class analysis ni Karl Marx dito sa centrism ni Immanuel Wallerstein. Your core are your bourgeoisie. Then your periphery would now be your proletariats. Now, the core will now exploit what? Yung mga resources coming sa periphery. Now, tanda natin, an example of the periphery would now be Philippines. Kasi I do not believe that Philippines is a second-class country. We are still poor. Although that is my own bias, no? Sabihin na natin would now be states in Africa rather, di ba? when we look into Africa, 'di ba, Africa is underdeveloped. So napaka-undeveloped niya. But when you look into the resources, ang yaman-yaman ng Africa, agriculture, mining, diamonds for instance, even gold, lahat ng raw resources mayaman ng Africa. But it is being exploited by your core European countries, United States. Kukunin nila yung resources in a cheap price. Then, ang meron kasi sa core is they have the firms, yung technological innovation, to convert those resources into final products, which would now be goods. So, sa periphery, ang meron sa kanila is production. The core will now convert it into consumption. At yung na-convert nila na final product, goods, they will now sell it to the semi-periphery and also in the periphery for a higher price. They get their raw resources at a very cheap price, convert it, pinatungan, they now put additional capital on it, then ibebenta din nila sa periphery at sa semi-periphery at a higher price. Kaya ang nangyari dyan, lumalakas yung core natin. At unting-unting humihirap yung ating periphery. So this is now your core, semi-periphery, and periphery. Now also, you could now distinguish this actually as your first world country, yung core, semi-periphery as your second world country, and your periphery as your third world country. Or even developed, developing, undeveloped. Iba-ibang classifications actually yan when we look into world systems. Going forward, I hope medyo na-gets. Eurocentrism is also a type of centrism. Now, this more likely focus on the origins of globalization. Ano ang ibig sabihin nito, no? That globalization simply started or originated in Europe. So for instance, imperialism, colonialism, yung sinakop tayo ng mga Espanyol, that is now a notion of Eurocentrism. And look, second definition, it was Europe who initiated modern ideas. So Europeans will now brag, we now bring you Christianity. We now give you civilization, my ass. Although just to critic not to critic Europeans, to critic imperialism. Or another thing would now be education. We now develop and spread modern education, technology, industrial revolution. Industrial revolution started in London, Paris, and in Berlin, diba? So in terms of technology, kami nagsimula ng steam engine revolution and the start of globalization through your industrial revolution. Even your ideas kano, diba? Your philosophy, although there's debate later, sooner or later. So that is Eurocentrism. We also have multiculturalism. Kaaway to ng school of thought ng centrism at Eurocentrism. Multiculturalism opposes what Eurocentrics attempting to provide or defend, that they started globalization. Multiculturalism stated no. Globalization was driven by multiple poles. So when we talk about poles, para siyang capital, multiple cultures around the world. So globalization started not just in a single region, but it all started from several countries, cultures, civilizations around the world. China started the Silk Trade. So for instance, sinasabi Europeans, we started, for instance, ano nga ba yung sinimulan ng mga Europeans? We now started a concrete system of governance. But Chinese would now argue, no, we have now developed the first civil system in the world. Or even Incas, yung mga nasa Latin America, no, we have our own system of government. India will also argue, no, kami. So that is multiculturalism. So globalization started in multiple poles. Next, orientalism. So sinasabi daw ng orientalism, globalization originated in Eastern region. So this would now be your Asia. Kaya the term there is Orient. So for instance, in terms of China, ano na contribute ng China that would now progress us to the time of modernity? So for instance, would now be paper. Or rather, yung sinabi ko kanina, civil service system. China crafted yung modern day civil service system or yung basis ng modern day civil system natin, yung how government is being managed, bureaucracy. Or another thing would now be spices, India, Moluccas. Or in Persia and Arabia, education. Baghdad was a cradle for civilization when we talk about education. Baghdad, the capital of Iraq. Or rather your religions, diba? All started in this area, this small piece of area, yung mga major religions of the world. and quote-unquote religion is equated with philosophy. Although, debatable din yan. Still skeptical. And also, another concept when we look into Orientalism, it all started with the Silk Trade, wherein all ideas and technology were now transformed, or rather not transformed, sorry, transported going to Europe. So, nagsimula sa Asia. So those are your perspective in globalization. Ang daming terminologies, but these are vital when we attempt to understand and study the subject. Now, still going from origins of globalization, how globalization spread or started. So there are two terminologies now. We have exogamous, then endogamous. So looking into the term endo and exo, mas madali natin siya maintindihan by looking into the prefix. Now, when we look into endo, basically it means inner, paloob. But basically, globalization has started from going inside. So it started from one region, similar with centrism or eurocentrism, then it now spreads around the world. So dito, yung argument nila as an example would now be European started globalization. So that is an endogenous process. So from Europe spreading around the world, we now influence religion, education, culture, etc. On the other hand, exogenous is very similar with multiculturalism. So multiple poles, cultures ang nag-spread. So endogenous, para siyang centrism. Exogenous, para siyang multiculturalism. So here are the references that I've used. So these are actually the actual readings in the original syllabus of the contemporary world. No? However, we need to fit in, to scale it down, especially ito yung approach natin in this subject. So I hope medyo madami natutunan kahit medyo magulo ang mag-example. So thank you guys. I hope you're doing fine. So once again, this is me, Kurt Zeus. Then so long.